Real quick before we get started, I'm enjoying doing these IDW Transformer issue breakdowns. And you know me, I'm not a like, comment, and subscribe kind of guy. I've never asked any of you to ring a bell or whatever that is for notification. I've never done it myself for other people. I don't expect anybody else to do it for me. However, if this IDW stuff doesn't find an audience and starts to hurt the algorithm of my channel, I obviously can't continue to produce it because I can't sort of undo what I'm doing for the sake of something I want to do, if that makes sense. So my advice is, if you like this sort of content and you want to see it remain on my channel and not go behind the paywall on Patreon, to sort of share it around and spread it through word of mouth and put it in groups or whatever you got to do in order to bring attention to it. Otherwise, I'm probably going to have to take it off my channel. But of course, I'm going to give it a couple more months to see how it shakes out because I'd like to see it remain on my channel. But time will tell. Let's get started. We'll continue our IDW coverage of Phase 2 with More Than Meets the Eye, issue number 4. Written by James Roberts, art by Alex Milne, colors by Josh Burcham, letters by Sean Lee and Chris Mowry, and edits by John Barber. And the book opens with an ominous scene foreshadowing the future at an obscure Autobot medical facility called Delphi, said to be at the edges of DJD territory. And First Aid, who's the character this book opens with, is working on a journal or a diary entry, who says, by the time you pull this data pad from what's left of my fingers, Delphi will be a swear word or a threat or a warning, the kind of word that makes people break eye contact. But he's working on this journal entry nonetheless, and he talks about how he was demoted from doctor to nurse by Rung, who diagnosed him as having erratic behavior and obsessive compulsive tendencies. And once that was handed down to Ambulon, who I guess was the guy overseeing him, he got bumped down to nurse. First Aid says it's not that he's obsessive compulsive, he just has a passing interest in Autobot badges that have apparently interfered with his work. And I find that to be so funny because there's been so many variations of Autobot badges over the years of, different waves and iterations, and he's just been obsessed with them all. And I just think that's cool. It's like a little nod and a wink to the fans, but that's not the only one here in these opening pages. So he's reminiscing about an event that happened recently where these two Decepticons, who he titles as Genericons, frontline fodder that you can tell by the shape and size of their badges, were attacked by the DJD and wanted safe haven at Delphi, and Ambulon took them in. But another character by the name of Pharma, who seems to be in control of this facility, and First Aid describes as an amazing doctor, although a control freak, hates Decepticons with a capital H. And he wanted to send them back out into the cold. But Ambulon made a case for them, said that they were harmless and they couldn't even transform because they had scars on their chest indicating that their transformation cogs had been cut out, which is in line with Triple M, the militant monoform movement, a religious faction who reject Adaptus by having their transformation cogs removed. So instead of being turned out into the cold, they are held captive. And you would think that would be the end of it, but it turns out they share a branch spark, a sort of overlapping nervous system. And because they were close to full synthesis, they're actually in extreme pain being separated from one another. And First Aid leaves off by saying Pharma never got to perform an operation to save them from this need of conjoining, because shortly after that they received a phone call and people started crying, at which point he's interrupted and he has to put his data pad down, and we jump to Swerve's bar. Now, keep in mind this is 2 days earlier, but the scene mainly revolves around Ratchet and Swerve having a conversation about a message that Ratchet had received from Delphi. There's some funny stuff that takes place during it, one of which being where Swerve admits that he freaks Red Alert out by rearranging all of his furniture in his habitation suite while he's asleep or out and about and pretend that nothing had happened. And Red Alert kind of already has like paranoia and anxiety issues, like stuff like that, like good fun, good character building stuff. But Ratchet's more interested in this message that he received from Delphi, where it's really a matter of statistics. He says the statistics start 2 years ago, and at first they fluctuate between 0% and 20% of patients are dying every month, which is tragic, but within normal parameters. But then the death rate starts to climb and plateau, and for the last 6 months, precisely half of all patients have died every month. He says, Swerve, whoever sent that data log is trying to tell us something. And Swerve reminds him we're not far from Delphi, And Ratchet says, I know, and I think it's time I made a house call. So Ratchet, Pipes, and Drift make for the planet Mesitine, where Delphi is located. And when they find Delphi, they find a big red X on the door. And while they're trying to figure out exactly what they're going to do to get in, there is an interesting conversation between Ratchet and Drift, where Drift, being an ex-Decepticon, Ratchet says, "Are you scared of the DJD? An ex-con like you, high-profile ex-con? I've operated on POWs who've begged me not to save them. Decepticons who'd rather die than get added to the DJD's list as punishment for getting captured," which I just think is a cool little bit. But while standing outside this door with the red X on it, Pipes decides to take the initiative, transforms into his kind of Cybertronian truck mode, and bashes through the door. Thinking he's done such a great thing, he realizes he's in a pile of dead robot corpses, and Ratchet says that cross on the wall, the one you just ignored, is the universal plague symbol. It means stay the hell away in a billion languages. And just then, a almost zombie-esque bot is approaching Pipes from behind. Drift snaps into action and dispatches him. And shortly thereafter, they bump into First Aid. And First Aid explains the situation there is bad. It's been hit hard by this virus he calls the Red Rust, and everyone's dying. He says, "I was trying to find a patient. He escaped from the ward," and then finds the dead body from the bot that Drift just took the liberty of hacking down. And he says, "I see you found him first." Pipes is obviously becoming a bit of a nervous wreck as being exposed to this red rust, and First Aid assures him that he seems okay, but he marks him with the red X anyway because he has been exposed and it can lie dormant. So First Aid takes them basically to an infirmary, and he starts to describe the symptoms. He says your optics corrode and leak down your face, and then full-blown liquefaction. Every hinge, every pivot, everything rusts, and your spark starts to collapse. Drift asks why he didn't call, and he said all communications have been shut down since the Big Bang, which happened 5 days ago, where they heard a loud noise like an explosion. Afterwards, people started getting sick, and he thinks the DJD detonated some kind of dirty bomb. It just can't work out where. And obviously, they've been distracted by trying to cure all these infected bots. So Ratchet begins to assess them as well, and he says, "I can't help noticing, Ambulon, that none of your older patients are showing signs of infection. They're not crying." And Ambulon says, "Yeah, for some reason, the long-term patients aren't affected." Ratchet says, "Is this everyone there in the infirmary?" And Ambulon says, "Not quite." Ratchet says, "I heard he was still alive. For his sake, I'd sort of hoped it wasn't true." Ambulon says, "Pharma calls it an eternal coma. We've tried everything to wake him up." And First Aid says, "Everything, that's a teensy bit misleading, isn't it?" And First Aid goes to express that he has this theory of spark resuscitation. Basically, you use a healthy spark to boost a faltering one. He calls it jump starting. Ambulon thinks it's too risky, but he'd like to give it a shot. And it's at that point that you realize that Pharma himself is in a quarantine room. He was working in there when they heard the Big Bang, and the door sealed itself automatically. It won't come open until enough time has passed for all known technopathogens to die out, but that could theoretically take millions of years. And they're trying to communicate with him behind this thick glass, and Ratchet is sure that Ambulon can override the lock. He says, "You're the ward manager. You've got clearance to unlock anything." And at that point, Pharma burns a message in the palm of his hand that says, "Your friend is upset." And over their shoulder, they see that Pipes is beginning to change. He says, "I feel funny. I'm scared. It feels wet and horrible." And he begins sort of spewing the red rust out of his face. Drift says, "Ratchet, he's cornered me. What do I do?" Ratchet advises something non-fatal, and Drift hits him over the head with the hilt of his sword. And during the midst of all this, Ambulon freed Pharma, who went off running to the cells. He says he's worked out what happened. And they pick up Pipes' body and make their way back to the infirmary. And while they're working on Pipes, they look over at Drift, and he started crying with the red rust as well. And just when you thought things couldn't get any worse, Pharma is now thrown into the room. And he says, "They were waiting for me. The Decepticons, someone had already let them out. Some sort of remote override." And those two Decepticons, the two they originally let in, walk in with the intention to send them all to the morgue. But they're saved by First Aid, who used his jump-starting technique to revive Fortress Maximus, who makes a pretty incredible entry and says, "Do you two realize where you're standing?" "No? Then let me explain. My name is Fortress Maximus. 5 years ago, I was attacked by a Decepticon so powerful he redefined the word. He took me down hard. I was paralyzed, lobotomized, and left for dead. All of which means that right now, you two Decepticons, being the very first Decepticons I've encountered since I was all but beaten to death, are standing in the very worst place in the universe." Now, this whole story on the medical side of things is sort of backlit against this other story of Tailgate trying to choose a faction. And the news of this breaks with Rodimus and Ultra Magnus having a conversation. And Ultra Magnus breaks the news to Rodimus that Tailgate wants to become a Decepticon. And Rodimus says, well, he can't, can he? Not without Megatron or one of the Conclave presiding over the affiliation ceremony, which, by the way, is a lot more invasive than ours. Seriously, Drift says they rip out a portion of your spark casing and turn it into a Decepticon badge. But it really comes down to Ultra Magnus not having the control he would prefer and having to live in this sort of ship of chaos, questioning whether or not he should have come. He says, look, it's my job to maintain order on this ship, and that's not easy when people like Tailgate start acting unpredictably. He goes on to say, now that the war's over, everyone seems a lot more individual. I don't like it. And Rodimus says, leave Tailgate to me. So they go to talk to Tailgate, and they take Rewind with them. And Rodimus says, Rewind has millions of years of Cybertronian history stored on his internal database. He's going to share some of it with you via a Cerebro stream of super compressed visual data. Tailgate, you're about to see the edited highlights of our war, all our darkest hours in 11.3 seconds. I just want you to remember two things. And he shows them the two faction symbols and says Autobot, Decepticon. The rest you should be able to work out for yourself. And Rewind plays him the 11.3 seconds, which is a highlight of the war. Megatron's rise to power, the fall of the Grand Imperium, Zeta Prime and the gunshot that killed a civilization, Declaration Day, the fall of the first 5 cities, all of the kind of highlight battles that defined the war, a war that pushed their race to the brink of extinction. And Tailgate comes from it and says, okay, you've made your point, and goes to see Cyclonus. And he says, you lied to me. You made me look like an idiot. All that scrap about the Decepticons being freedom fighters when you knew they were the bad guys. You knew. Cyclonus says, I gave you the briefest overview of the war through the eyes of an outsider. You're the one who decided you wanted to pick a side. Good guys and bad guys, do you really think life is that straightforward? And Tailgate punches him on the arm and says, you let me walk around the Autobot ship and tell everyone I wanted to be a Decepticon. And then Cyclonus back smacks the brakes off of him. Kicks him once for good measure and walks out of the room and leaves a Tailgate shaking there on the floor, uttering, I'm sorry. And that's the last we see of those two for this issue, and really begins to start to flesh out their relationship and dynamic. And that brings this book to a close. And this is the kind of section that begins to define exactly what this series is, More Than Meets the Eye. It's an adventure series. And there's an overarching story, and that overarching story is set against these series of adventures that these bots get themselves into and find ways through. And through the midst of that, define more elements of the mythology, more elements of the characters, and more elements of the history than we've ever really seen in previous Transformer lore, which is kind of the beauty of it. At this point, between both books, More Than Meets the Eye and Robots in Disguise, we start to see formula begin to lock down and expose for what the coming issues are going to be. But there's a lot of cool stuff here, a lot of cool character traits about First Aid, more ideological conversations to be had regarding good guys, bad guys, Autobots, and Decepticons. And those components, at least the good guy, bad guy components, which are kind of the more meatier, juicier elements of the book, are really standing in the shadow of a kind of robot zombie story with an infectious disease ripping through the ranks of an outpost on a remote planet that a team of medical bots have to get to the bottom of. And it's stuff like this that I've always loved about IDW, where they really kind of push the limits of what Transformer stories can be, especially in this era where it didn't have to be Autobots versus Decepticons. Now you have kind of a sci-fi story of a handful of Autobots that happen to be given the responsibilities and education of medical duties that have to use that training and use those sets of skills in order to solve a bigger problem that guns and blasters and everything else isn't necessarily capable of. With the exception of Fort Max, who's probably going to tear these Decepticons limb from limb, but no spoilers. Anyway, I'll be back next month with another installment. Hope that helps. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Until next time, take care.